Welcome everyone to today's special webinar event. I'm Terry Ryder, founder of Hotspotting, and today we're going to discuss real estate investment from the viewpoint of strategy, the importance of having a strategy to underpin what you do with real estate. And I'm always amazed at how many people don't have a defined strategy. And then we're going to talk about a specific strategy designed to achieve your investment goals better and faster. Today's special guest presenter to walk us through all that is Andrew Courtney, who's Managing Director of Plenitude Wealth. Andrew, welcome.
Thanks very much for having me, Terry.
Really looking forward to today's presentation. Interested to see and hear what you've got to tell us today about a particular strategy that you believe can help people get to those retirement objectives better, faster, and with more.
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually one that doesn't get covered at all in any kind of financial planning curriculum. So it's one that I haven't seen anyone do. So strap your seatbelts in and get your notepad handy and your pen and write it all down, because I'm going to go through a specific strategy in a few minutes time where you could start to incorporate some of these things for your specific property acquisition plan and acquire a few more properties prior to retirement. So very powerful stuff.
Okay. Looking forward to it. So you've got a presentation to share with us?
Yes, I do. Let me share my screen and we can get going. Okay, what have we got here? Just give me 1 minute. There it is. Okay, can you see this okay?
I can. Unlock
Brilliant.
hidden borrowing power.
Yes, how to grow your portfolio even as you approach retirement, right? So let me go through this step by step. And like I said earlier, make sure you write a ton of notes down, and there'll be ample opportunity for me to answer questions as well. Feel free to write the questions in the chat box and or the Q&A area in Zoom. This is all general information only. Do not take this as personal advice. If you'd like some personal advice, feel free to reach out to myself and my team. We can definitely help you out on that front. Right, so it's all about more properties in the end of the day. Why properties? Well, as we all know, what you can do with property is an amazing, like a leverage return, an amplified return on investment. So we're going to show you exactly what we do for us and for our personally and for our clients, so we can eke out an extra few more properties in the portfolio sooner rather than later, without having to wait for properties becoming positively geared and all of that kind of stuff, which takes quite some time, especially in high interest rate environments. Right. Cool. So the real retirement risk that no one talks about is the fact that there are plenty of opportunities available to us, but since we don't know about it, we can't really tap into it. The analogy that I always use is if you're driving down a 4-lane highway, let's say, and there's the left lane and there's the right lane, the two middle lanes. Unfortunately, most Aussies are driving on the slow lane, not realizing that there are a bunch of other options, i.e. the middle 2 lanes and the right lane, to get to their destination a hell of a lot faster. So today I'm going to be sharing with you some of those strategies, because like I always say, there's a conservative, proactive and aggressive strategy available to each and every one of us. And it's up to us to work out, well, what do those strategies actually look like? And more importantly, what are we most comfortable with, right? Because not everyone can drive the fast lane, right? But everyone can certainly drive in the slow lane. So it's a question of how much faster do you want to get to your goals, and what are the trade-offs associated with utilizing the different kinds of strategies, right? So I'm curious, I want to run a quick poll of sorts, right, for you guys. If you don't mind just answering this particular question, are you currently nearing, or are you at the end of your borrowing capacity? Have you used it all up? 1, if you have. 2, if you haven't, if you've got plenty of borrowing capacity to spare. Very curious to see what kind of borrowing capacity we've got in the audience here. So feel free to type it in the chat box. 1, if you've maxed out your borrowing capacity. 2, if you've got borrowing capacity to spare. I'd love to see some answers in the chat box, and then we can get on with the presentation. Why am I asking this? It's about understanding what the audience is all about, so that we can cater for their specific purposes. Sorry, Jay, you're saying?
Yes, we've already got a couple of people in the Q&A panel, and there's a one there. So I think that means that the people who feel they've maxed out the borrowing capacity,
Okay.
and more coming in with the same answer. Seems to
Okay.
be a common problem.
Yeah. Oh, there you go. Fantastic. There's a poll there. Okay. So yes. So we've maxed out borrowing capacity. So today I'm going to be sharing with you some of the strategies that you may want to consider to actually replenish your existing borrowing capacity. So some of you guys will be very excited to know that there are a few other options available to you. So let's get going. So the myth is this: your personal borrowing capacity is your only option, right? So the vast majority of you guys who've said, yes, I suspect, have acquired all of the investment properties in your principal place of residence under your personal names, right? And this is where a lot of Aussies get trapped, unfortunately, right? So by planning a little bit more, what happens is you can open up some more of your borrowing capacity, thereby allowing you to acquire more, essentially. So this is why most investors hit a wall. What's that wall? It's the 6 times debt to income ratio, right? This is the ceiling that most investors hit. And then they wait for 5-7 years until we get more income or get the pay rises. And then we go back to the banks, begging for some more, essentially. So how do we circumvent that and speed up the process of more acquisitions, right? What I'd love to do right now is imagine having unlimited borrowing capacity. What would you do then, right? Obviously, there's 2 main things, bottlenecks, that slow us down from acquiring property, right? Having the deposit, funds to complete, and the borrowing capacity to do so. Because acquiring property outright, in my humble opinion, is not exactly the best producing return on investment out there. But with debt, you can go up to 105% loan to value ratio. This is when it gets super exciting as far as return on investment is concerned. So what I'd love for you guys to do is park the existing thoughts and theories aside for a second. Let's get it to a stage where let's get open to some ideas that a lot of my clients are currently doing, right? And it starts with, imagine having unlimited borrowing capacity. What would you be doing with your finances then, right? Now, let's talk about 3 wells. Most people are aware of their personal well. They go to the bank, get the borrowing capacity. Max borrowing capacity is X, Y, and Z, right? We get up to, for the vast majority of us in this room, right, we get up to max borrowing capacity and acquire as many properties as possible. And then we get stuck, right? There's only 1 out of 3 wells that are available to us, right? So if we look at it from a perspective of what is possible, there's the personal well, there's the trust well of borrowing capacity, and there's the superannuation well that is available to you, right? So today I'm going to be sharing with you how you can maximize these things so that we're not 100% reliant on our personal well alone, right? Because where most Aussies go wrong is all they know is the personal well, not realizing that there are ample opportunities through trust and superannuation as well, right? So the personal well, as everyone's aware, right, the most familiar, but the most limiting, right? The great thing about the personal well is you can tap into negative gearing straight away. So it's more of a short-term benefit than a medium to long-term benefit, right? The next one is your trust. In my humble opinion, this is underrated, right? Why? It's because of the costs associated with establishing a trust and the compliance fees associated on a year-to-year basis. If you can ignore that short-term pain, guess what? The medium-term and long-term gain that you have through acquiring under a trust and being able to replenish your borrowing capacity totally outweighs the few $1,000s that you need to pay to maintain said properties in your portfolio, right? And the third and final well is your superannuation, the sleeping giant, which I'm going to be sharing with you how you can maximize even more borrowing capacity or grow the borrowing capacity that you currently have inside of your superannuation. Very powerful stuff if you get this right, because as you can imagine, if you structure your finances really, really well, you can actually double or triple your current borrowing capacity. Very powerful stuff. Because if you know how to invest in property, the returns that you can get is outsized relative to the share market with no margin, right? And what happens is you can amplify the rate or the velocity of money that you have, thereby doubling your assets faster and, more importantly, replacing your income sooner through your investments, right? So how the wealthy use multiple wells? Well, it's about understanding that there are multiple wells available to us first and foremost and exploring, well, what's the next best move for your specific situation? Basically, right? So I'm curious, guys, Another question that I'd love to ask, and a poll if you don't mind, Tim, if we can, right? How many wells are we currently using at the moment? So the vast majority of us in this room right now has actually utilized max borrowing capacity at the moment. But I'm curious, how many wells are you using? 1, 2, or 3? Personal name, trust, and or superannuation. 3, if you use all 3 entities and have acquired properties through 3 entities. 2 if it's just 2 out of the 3, and then 1 if it's just your personal name. I'd love to kind of see what kind of audience we've got at the moment, so that we can see, I can sort of cater for more information for the right people, basically. So I'd love to see that. How are we doing there? Are we getting some answers?
We are in the Q&A panel. We've got some who are just using one that's using 2, and just one who's using 3. So there's a bit of a mixture there, but it feels like most
people aren't using 3, right? So this is an opportunity for us. And for the people who have used 3, guess what? There's a particular strategy that I'm going to be sharing with you that's not covered anywhere in Australia. So make sure you write some notes down, because there's ample opportunity to max your borrowing capacity out even further if you're willing to make the necessary trade-offs that I was referring to a little bit earlier.
Everyone's using one or 2, but only one who's responded is using 3.
Excellent. So for some of you guys who are keen to learn more about speeding up your wealth creation journey, I've recently ran a webinar, an online sort of training course to 10x in 10 years, right? So there's the blueprint for that, right? Feel free to go into this particular QR code, type in your details, and suddenly you'll get access to these particular webinars that I've ran recently. Last month earlier this month, I should say, I ran a tax minimization blueprint for this FY. So if you're keen to learn more about lowering your taxes and to go over in more detail some of the stuff that I'm going to be talking to you about today, feel free to click on this link and put in your details and grab access to these particular webinars, because I'm sure it'll blow your mind with some of these particular strategies, because a lot of people sleep on these things, not realizing that there's a framework in wealth creation. And if you're strategic in your approach, it's amazing how much faster you can get to your targets. Now, why LVR matters more than you think, right? I like to harp on about LVRs because lazy equity, there's a ton of lazy equity out there. And unfortunately, with lazy equity, it means shrinking return on investment, right? So let me break that down for you. The higher the loan to value ratio, the higher the return on investment. There's a positive correlation between your return on investment, your full return on investment on the capital that you put in, right, relative to your loan to value ratio. So for example, if you buy a $500,000 property with 500 grand outright, right, versus $500,000 property with $100,000 deposit, right, and if they both return, let's just call it 10% for the year, right, 10% in cash, 10% in growth, right, what's the return on investment on the 500 grand? That is approximately a 10% growth, that's 50 grand. So that's a 10% return on investment. Whereas if you get a 10% return in the leverage component, right, where you put in 100 grand and you get a 50 grand uplift, let's say, ignoring the cash flow implication, right, you're getting a pretty sizable return on the 100 grand. That's as high as 50%. If you take away the cost associated or the deficit associated with that, you can get returns of 25, 30%. Basically. So this is what I'm talking about when it comes to loan to value ratio. And it depends on where you're at in your investment journey. Well, that will determine what kind of loan to value ratio you're most comfortable with. Because if you're stopping working at in 6 months' time and you don't have a buffer, guess what? Having a higher loan to value ratio may affect the strategy moving forward, right? So you got to temper this thing. But the key message is this. The higher the loan to value ratio, the higher the return on investment on the equity, on the capital that you put into each project, right? So the rule is this: if you want to acquire more properties, ideally you want to acquire it with more debt. Therefore, we want to explore, well, how do we expand our borrowing capacity to be able to cater for this particular strategy, right? Good stuff. So the LVR breakdown by entity. What is the max LVR that we can chase after? Under a trust, under an SMSF, and under personal, right? So under an SMSF, a self-managed super fund, you can go up to 80%. Under a trust, you can go up to 90%, and personal, 105%. right? And this is where you can get outsized performance. Now, some of this, you'll have to pay lenders' mortgage insurances, right? And others, like an SMSF, you have to pay a premium on top of the cost. But providing you acquire the right robust assets, right? One that Hotspotting would recommend for you on the LGAs that they're currently targeting with their research, what happens is you can increase the likelihood of achieving outsized outperformance, right, from the marketplace. Right. So quick return on investment sort of results for our clients, right? In the first 3 years of acquiring a property with the help of Terry and the team, basically it's Hotspotting, and we've got a robust process where we start to filter off how do we get investment grade properties. These are the kind of results that we get. Now you'll notice in year 1, 2, and 3, there are quartile results. The top quartile result in the growth for that year 1 property is 28.35%, right? The bottom is 11.23%. So in other words, the average is around 19% growth for all of the properties we've acquired. Now, over the past 6 months, we've acquired just shy of 50 properties for our clients, right? We're not a high volume business because ultimately we start off with financial planning first, and we ensure that the strategy is in line with the timeline that they've got and the goals that they want to achieve within the next 3 to 10 years, essentially. Year 2 is much higher at an average of approximately 34%, right? In year 3, the average around 50% uplift over a 3-year period. So we buy a $500,000 property, we expect, and our internal goal is to get it up to $750K of growth within the 3-year period, basically, right? So that's the power of getting things right and creating a robust process that produces results again and again. Now, as far as your borrowing capacity is concerned, there are 2 main things to consider. What is your strategy outside of superannuation, and what is your strategy inside of superannuation? Right? Because if you don't look at it from 2 parallel strategies, what happens is people tend to ignore one and just focus on the other the whole time, not realizing that there's a bunch of opportunity with the other one, basically, right? Okay, secret number 1, self-declarations in trust. I know some of you guys may already be using this, but for a lot of you who aren't aware of this, this is the power of acquiring 1 property per trust, basically. What you can do is, if you haven't maxed out your borrowing capacity, right, what you can do is you can acquire your next property through a family trust. And guess what? If you manage to do that, you've got enough deposit for the next one, what you can do is you can go again and again and again and again. If you're working with specific banks, that'll sort of not even look at the trust financials because you have self-declared as a going concern for that particular trust. It is profitable, right? And if you self-declare and do that again and again and again, and if you've got $500,000 worth of cash, capital to invest, guess what? On a 20% deposit, you can acquire 3 or 4 more, depending on price points. On a 10% deposit, you might be able to acquire 5 or 6 more properties, right? So this is the power of getting the structure correct, right? And obviously, you've got to make sure that your cash flow can permit, because each and every property will most likely have a deficit, right? So the key thing that I'd love for you to take away is, how do you expand your borrowing capacity outside of super? And the unlock is to acquire in family trusts. Yes, there's a cost associated with establishing it. There's a cost in maintenance, but guess what? If you're getting outsized returns and if your properties are producing for you, right, you've created your own business, a money-making machine that makes it worthwhile to spend the compliance costs on a year-to-year basis and the establishment costs, right? Because it pays for itself multiple times over through capital growth and the rental return. That supplements the income or the cost associated with it, or offsets the cost associated with each property, right? Hopefully this is hitting the spot for you guys. Any questions, just hit me up in the chat box and or the Q&A area, right? Secret number 2. This is a big one. For all of you guys who are using your self-managed super fund, you're typically using your capital in your super as a deposit and your super guarantee contributions and maxing out your concessional contributions, your pre-tax contributions for your serviceability. Guess what? You can extend out your borrowing capacity through tapping into this thing called a non-concessional contribution inside of super, right? What is a non-concessional contribution? It is literally a post-tax contribution into your superannuation, and you can put in as much as $120,000 per year, right? So As you can imagine, if the cost to hold on to a property inside of super with an 80% loan to value ratio is approximately $15,000 to $17,000 per year, right? And you maxed out your concessional contributions at 30K, your pre-tax contributions up to 30K, and you don't have any more serviceability as far as the bank's concerned, if you top it up through non-concessional contribution, you can top up that 15 to 20 to 25K per year, thereby giving you more serviceability for your property strategy inside of a self-managed super fund, right? Very powerful stuff. It gets ignored by a lot of people because most people can't bring it all together, right? So they get stuck with a certain amount of borrowing capacity and they feel that they're trapped. But if you know what the rules are, what happens is you can manipulate the system to give you more borrowing capacity. Then it's a question of how you're going to solve the capital challenge, right? Because remember, the banks want two things: capital, funds to complete, and serviceability. I'm just sharing with you what you do with the serviceability side. Now, how do we solve for the capital, right? Especially if you used up all your deposit or you've got a diversified portfolio. Let's say you got some shares and property in your SMSF, but you can't see for the life of you how you can get that extra one. Then I'm going to be sharing with you a case study that we're doing specifically for some clients of ours, and where we saved them $200,000 at the bare minimum for their particular strategy, right? So we can go through that shortly. Cool. All right. This is the strategy. The strategy is parking equity smartly, right? So what it is this. For a lot of us in this room right now, right, we have a home that's got less than 50%, less than 30% loan to value ratio, almost paid off. And for some of us, fully paid off, right? What is that saving us by keeping that in there? It is saving us the interest rate, right? Let's assume 6% interest rate. So by leaving the equity in your home, you are saving yourself 6% cost of capital. Now, if you pull out that equity, if you've got enough borrowing capacity to pull that equity out in a cash out investment loan, what you can potentially do is make a non-concessional contribution in super, right? Now, to give you the caveat of this, if you pull out an investment loan on that and put it into super, the interest is not tax deductible, right? Because you're double dipping in a way, because any dollar that you put into super is in a tax effective environment. So the government won't allow you to get a tax deduction on that cash out. But you're still getting the upside of investing in a superannuation environment that's getting taxed at a maximum 15 cents on the dollar, right? If you own it for more than 1 year, 10 cents on the dollar. And more importantly, if you're getting close to retirement age, right, 60 years and above, what you can do is you can park as much of your home's equity in your SMSF, right, in your superannuation, right, and get taxed 0 cents on the dollar, and then move the funds back when you deem appropriate. And when is it appropriate? Well, it's up to you. Every single person's different on the different timeline, right? Because the key here is the cost, the trade-off is 6% per annum. And what is the upside? What is the return on investment you can pursue with hundreds of thousands of dollars that you can add into your superannuation? That's the big question, right? And if you're in a couple, right, you can put in $120K each. So that's $240K per year that you can put into your super. And you can do this thing called the bring forward rule, which is essentially bringing 3 years of 120, that is $360K each, that you can put into your super. So one scenario could be one part of the couple puts in $360K, the other one puts $120 in every single year. And what happens? You've got unlimited borrowing capacity again. So what you can do is you can reverse engineer the outcome of acquiring more properties inside of your SMSF purely because you've got capital available to you, right? So this is the window of opportunity that's closing in on us for the people who are just about to retire. So if you get this right, and if you come up with a plan of attack prior to retirement, you can access the equity at a cost of capital of 6%, and you can make those dollars work harder for you inside of superannuation, basically. Very powerful stuff if you get things right. So like I said, capital and surplus. So the surplus is the borrowing capacity, is the serviceability side of the equation. You need to balance things out to ensure that you can afford to hold on to these particular properties, because the fact of the matter is there's not very many high yielding properties out there. We're not at a surplus of high yielding properties that'll be positively geared from the get-go. Therefore, our surplus needs to cover off on the deficit, surplus cash flow. Now, the beauty is this: if you can talk yourself into accepting the fact that you can use your capital to cover the deficit, you can buy yourself some serious runway, 5 to 10 more years, until those properties deficit decrease all the way down to zero, until it's neutrally geared and or positively geared for you, so that you can hold on to it for the longer period, right? Because what you're trying to do is you amplify the return on investment on the capital you have, whilst you still have borrowing capacity available to you, right? Hopefully this is all making sense. Any questions, just hit me up. Happy to be interrupted as well, Terry, if you've got any questions for me, right? So the leverage in action within the SMSF is very, very powerful. It's about creating a story, a case for the lenders to lend you more money in your super, because if you're acquiring with an 80% loan to value ratio versus acquiring a full amount inside of your SMSF, we're talking like 2x, 3x return more with leverage, right? So this is where it makes perfect sense to go ahead and do so, right? So for families out there who are trying to grow their wealth and, more importantly, pass on their wealth through the future generations, right? This is something that you can do to amplify and to double your assets prior to you stopping work, basically, thereby growing the pie for you and your family, and thereby allowing you to give the options and flexibility that you want in your life, and to curate the experiences that you want within the next 3 to 10 years, essentially, right? So the tax angle, I mean, why? Why is it so important? Well, the beauty is, as I said earlier, like if you're acquiring under your personal name, you're stuck with your marginal tax rate upon sale and upon the income that you produce from the properties that you have in your portfolio. If you acquire under a trust, you've got the option to distribute the income and or capital gains upon sale to different entities. You might have some kids who are adults, right? Studying university, you can distribute capital gains to them. For the income side of the equation, you may want to distribute to a corporate beneficiary, right? So acquiring assets under a trust may cost you quite a bit in the first few years, but in the middle and long term, what happens is you end up having ample opportunity to distribute the sale and the capital gains and the income side of the equation to the lowest marginal tax rate entity, basically. And obviously in the superannuation fund, what happens is you're only getting taxed 15 cents on the dollar at a maximum rate, 10% of capital gains tax over 12 months, if you own something for over 12 months. And once you retire, you're getting taxed at 0 cents on the dollar to 1.9 mil each, basically, right? We've obviously got that risk of anything above 3 mil of unrealized gains. So guess what? If you're getting close to 3 mil, you may not want to do these particular strategies, 3 mil each, that is, right? So within the SMSF, that gets you to 6 mil each. You may not want to acquire more growth-orientated assets for you because you're going to get slogged on the unrealized gains. So what I suggest we all do in this particular webinar right now is to gun for 3 mil ASAP and then rejig the portfolio accordingly so that you're producing income rather than growth capital gains inside of your SMSF, so that the government doesn't pick up all of the unnecessary taxes that we don't necessarily want to be paying. Yeah? Cool. All right, so the case study is this. We had a 58-year-old couple come to us 3 or 4 weeks ago saying, look, Andrew, we just sold our property. The cash will be hitting our bank account late June, right? We plan to acquire 3 or 4 properties under our names because we really want to grow our wealth prior to retirement. We've got about 5 or 6 years, potentially 7 years worth of work in front of us. And we need some help acquiring properties. Can you help us do that? Can you come up with a plan for us to do so? And I said, absolutely. But before we do that, I just want to clarify, why do you want to acquire under your name? Because if you do that, and if you plan to sell it in the future, what happens is you're going to get slogged with massive capital gains tax. How would you like to save $200,000 minimum of capital gains tax for that particular strategy? And they said, I'm all ears. Tell me. And I told them, well, why would you want to acquire under your name? You're 58 years old. You're just about to turn 60, right? You're hitting this thing called preservation age where you can access your superannuation at 60. Therefore, wouldn't it make more sense to acquire all of the properties that you're looking to acquire inside of an SMSF and come up with a strategy to give you the serviceability that you need to acquire all 4 properties inside of your SMSF rather than your personal names. Because guess what? Upon retirement in 6 or 7 years' time, guess how much tax you have to pay? 0. Right? And that absolutely floored them. Right? This is a strategy that people need to consider because it could be costing you hundreds of thousands of dollars, you and your family, worth of tax payable at the back end of your investment career. Getting the right entities and acquiring under the right entities is crucial for your strategy moving forward. If you don't get it right, it could be costing you tens of thousands, if not hundreds or millions of dollars worth of tax payable. And we don't necessarily want to be giving that away if we can help it. Right? Cool. All right. The cost of doing nothing. And we do have a question there, Terry. Shall we answer this particular question?
Certainly, if you're comfortable to do so at this point in the presentation. You've got the question in front of you in the Q&A panel.
Yeah. If you leverage your home into your SMSF and suffer any adverse financial issues before retirement and need access to the funds, can you get the money out of your SMSF? I suspect not, but would like to hear your view. It depends on how old you are. So the closer you are to 60, the easier it is to take this risk. If you're in your 40s, right, and there is a chance of an adverse effect as far as cash flow is concerned, right, I wouldn't suggest you park your equity from your home in your super because you can't access it until you're 60. If you're in your 60s, you can access it by retiring. Or you can do this thing called a transition to retirement where you can access your balance at the start of the financial year from 4 to 10%. That's the range that you can access on a year-to-year basis whilst you're still working, basically. So how I would normally structure this thing is to ensure that there's a massive buffer outside of superannuation in a redraw or an offset facility for the events in your life that's not necessarily going to help you, basically, to give you a runway to make the necessary adjustments, right, to either A, access your superannuation and bring the equity back, or B, buy you more time up until you hit preservation age. So this is a strategy for the 50-year-olds out there. The mid-50s is the sweet spot. Obviously, if you're in your 60s, this is something that you could tap into as well, basically. Right? Hopefully that's answered your question. So the cost of doing nothing is essentially the opportunity cost of the growth, the delta between 6% cost of capital and the return on investment that you could chase after. Now, from the returns that I was sharing with you earlier, some of our clients are getting over 100% return in the first year because we're getting massive returns on the property side of the equation, right? So if you were to just halve that or halve it again at 25% versus 6%, right? The delta is 19%. 19% over a 10-year period is a significant chunk of change for you and your family, right? That's the cost of doing nothing, right? And if you don't get a creative strategy, one is that aligned to your timeline and your specific needs, right? It's very, very difficult to pull all these things together. And you know what? It requires a team of specialists to bring it all together for you, because trying to do this by yourself is close to impossible, basically. Yeah, very, very difficult to do so. Cool. All right, so what do we got next? So the question is, are you ready to get unstuck? Right? And part and parcel of that is coming to these kinds of webinars, learning more, asking a whole bunch of questions, and clarifying exactly what's the next best step for you and your family to unlock more freedom and optionality in your life, basically. Now, who this is and isn't for, so who do we work with at Plenitude, essentially? So we work with 50-year-olds plus or minus 15 years, right? Earning a minimum of $250K per household, right? Minimum of $250K in super, and more importantly, capable of saving more than $25K per year. So we start off, we typically help millionaires, help them to get to a decamillionaire. That's pretty much the strategy. And for the decamillionaires out there, we have this offering called a family office, where we run your finances like our well-oiled business, and to ensure intergenerational transfer works perfectly for you, because a lot of families tend to keep finances as a taboo subject, basically. So who do we help? We help millionaires, multimillionaires get to decamillionaires, and we help decamillionaires build and create a plan of attack that helps them create their legacy with intergenerational wealth transfer, basically. We help ambitious and growth-oriented individuals and household only, basically. Right. So like I said earlier, if you're interested in learning more, we've got a few webinars, a few workshops that we've ran recently. And if you put in your details there, we'll invite you to more of these kinds of webinars. We try and educate first and foremost before we work with anyone, because the key is they need to understand the different strategies that are available to them, thereby allowing them to achieve their version of financial freedom a hell of a lot sooner. I look forward to seeing some of you in the very near future, and looking forward to answering some of the questions that you've got today. I've bombarded you with a whole bunch of information. So what I'd love to do is just kind of kick the ball around a little bit further and make sure that we leave no stone unturned before we wrap up this particular webinar. Thanks for your time. Good stuff. All right, stop sharing, Terry.
Okay, so the Andrew, thank you for that. The questions are rolling in. Shall I give you the first one? Andrew, can you please help on this, as I feel stuck with the information that I have for now? I'm 32, I have a principal place of residence, and I've used equity from that and bought one investment property, but I have no serviceability. I've maxed out. At this stage, even if I create a trust, I'm not able to get serviceability. Is that right, or am I missing something?
Yes, is the answer. I'm assuming you bought that investment property under your name again. So what's happened is you've hit the debt to income ratio ceiling, essentially. To get out of that, you need to sell one or transfer that investment property in a trust. That'll cost you stamp duty and capital gains tax. But it might be a necessary evil, depending on how much capital you've got available to you, because obviously you pulled out some equity, right? Because if you can do that, put it in a trust, and guess what? You get your borrowing capacity back. You can wash, rinse, repeat, and acquire more under trusts. That's how you would get around it. Unfortunately, you have to sell and or pay a massive sunk cost to transfer into a trust, right? That's the big one to get out of the situation that you're in, or play the long game, wait for income increase, right? Wait for rental increase, right? Rates to decrease, debts to be paid down, and then you get more borrowing capacity back that way. That's more of a longer medium-term time frame. Yeah. I might just read this one as well. If you leave properties in an SMSF and start to draw on income stream from retirement, are there still restrictions on residing in one of these properties for either myself or children? Yes, there's definitely a bunch of rules associated with that. You need to have it fully paid off, and you need to have expert guidance to give you the strategy and the story for the auditors to tick that box off. It is possible, but it requires a lot of toing and froing and making sure that you get the right paperwork in place for the auditors, because you don't want to be a non-compliant SMSF, basically. If you do have debt in it, though, it makes it very, very difficult, essentially, as far as the SMSF is concerned. The trap on the SMSF side, especially if you're drawing an income from your super, is you've got illiquid investments in property. Therefore, you need liquid investments to complement your property strategy, like the share portfolio, managed funds and stuff, and more importantly, having cash available to you to have the flexibility to make the certain moves, because you don't want to unnecessarily sell something, especially in the middle of a boom cycle, or create a fire sale, because the only way you can access is to sell it ASAP. Property, that is, right? So the hardest thing about property is that it's a little bit more illiquid than shares and cash. Well, it's a lot more illiquid, right? So you just need to keep that in mind in your timeline and in your strategy. All right, another one. What does self-declaration mean, and are there any potential legal or other consequences of doing so? Yeah, so what it is you are telling the banks that you are happy to take on the risk by self-declaring. So what you're doing is similar to what you do on a tax return on a year-to-year basis, right? You are declaring that all of the information is true, right? But if you get audited, the ATO will go through and forensically account for every single line item. And if it isn't true, you've got a fine, don't you? In the form of a bank, what happens is they're not on the hook for providing you with cash or debt because you've self-declared. They're not at risk of being sued for negligence or lending you too much money because you've self-declared. And this is where the barrier of entry of doing so is to establish a trust, basically. To establish a trust, you need an accountant, you need the right people around you to make sure that your strategy is robust, right? And this is why some banks have opted to allow this kind of thing, because they know the typical mum and dad Aussie who's wanting to acquire more properties and they want to max out their debt up to the gills, right? won't establish the trust because there's a barrier to entry because of the cost associated with it and the advice that you'd need to ensure that you know what you're doing, basically, right? Cool. Any other questions?
Andrew, could I, on behalf of our viewers, just ask you to clarify a point that's in my mind? There was a question a little bit earlier talking about that in their 30s, they had a principal place of residence and one investment property, and they had maxed out their borrowing capacity. What is it about creating a trust that suddenly gives them extra borrowing capacity? How does that work exactly?
Yeah, so the banks, so some banks will happily ignore what's in the trust. So as you can imagine, like if you've got 1.5 mil worth of borrowing capacity, right? You got a 1 mil PPR loan and 500K investment property loan. You've maxed out your borrowing capacity. If you acquired that $500,000 debt into a $600,000 property or so, right? In a trust, some banks will ignore that and see on your financials that you've only got a $1 million debt, thereby allowing you to acquire more properties, right? So the key is to acquire properties in new trusts so that you can wash, rinse, repeat again and again. And the self-declaration phase is what speeds up the process. The other one is getting a going concern letter from your accountant where they look at the financials, right? And this will take a few more years, right? They look at the financials and go, this is a profitable trust. Thereby, as a bank, you can lower your risk and ignore the trust completely. So then you're stuck with a $1 million debt again on your principal place of residence. And if your debt to income ratio is your max borrowing capacity is 1.5 mil, you get that 500 grand back again to go ahead and acquire another property. The caveat is you got to have the funds to complete to make it happen. Remember, two core things that the banks look at: deposit, funds to complete, and the serviceability, right? So to unlock more borrowing capacity, the trust is a great way of going about doing so.
Now, is it a case of creating a trust and buying multiple properties, or did I hear you say earlier one property per trust?
One property per trust is for the most aggressive people out there, basically, right? Because what happens is if you have, it depends on how much borrowing capacity you have, right? Because banks will only lend you if you've got borrowing capacity. And if you're acquiring inside the trust that's already got an investment property in there, right? They will take that debt into consideration along with everything outside, right? And if you hit your borrowing capacity max with that bank, guess what? You're stuck. You can't acquire in that trust. Whereas if you acquire in another trust, right, they'll ignore that initial trust, right, the debt that you have there, and allow you to borrow on the next one. So it depends on the situation. It depends on the borrowing capacity and how much cash and capital you have, basically.
And it depends on the attitude of the lender, I assume, because they probably don't have the same attitude to that situation.
Absolutely. That's it. Policies. Very important to work with a broker that knows how to maneuver around that. Yep.
Okay, so there's a question there about what type of trust are you recommending in order to use this declaration of trust?
It would be a family trust, a discretionary trust. Yep.
Okay. That question that's on the screen, we already dealt with that.
Yeah, I believe so.
So just last chance for people. We're getting towards the end of the allotted time for this webinar today. If you've got any burning questions, don't waste the opportunity to ask them live. And another one.
Here we go. Here's another one. I'll read this one out. I'm in my early 40s. I have one PPR, one investment property in my husband's name, one in SMSF. Excellent. Have about 600K in equity in my PPR. I, however, will have limited serviceability. Is planning to go down to one income. Yes. What would be a recommendation on my next best move to grow this portfolio? 600K in equity. Before you go down to one income, I would be suggesting you run the numbers and do the analysis on how much equity you can pull out. A, to give you a buffer and a runway, and B, how much can you afford to potentially park in your superannuation, right? And or acquire another one outside of super, right? Because it's a balancing act. Because if you're going from a two income household down to one, obviously the surplus drops down considerably and you might be at deficit. So what you need to do as far as cash flow is concerned, is buy yourself more time and more capital. So for example, one of our clients, right, they've got some equity in their home. They were just about to start a business. And I told them, before you start that business, let's pull out a bunch of equity, thereby giving you, putting less pressure on you as you start the business. Because starting a business with no dollars to your name is very different to starting a business with 200 grand in the bank account that can save you the hassle. Like 15 grand can solve a 15 grand problem very, very quickly. Whereas if you don't have cash in your name, you're stuck. You now have to be resourceful, and you have to sort of juggle a few balls to solve that problem, right? You don't want unnecessary pressure in your life. So in other words, for your situation, I'd be looking at creating a buffer first and foremost, because you're going down from a two income household to a one income household. And then from said buffer, it's work out, well, what is applicable to your circumstance, right? What kind of risks are you willing to take to acquire more properties in the future? In what entity? Personal name, trust, or SMSF? Those are three options. So you have to make a judgment call on what's the next best move for you, depending on the risk that you have, right? And the risk is determined by how much of a surplus is remaining when you go from two incomes down to one, right? Because your partner might be earning 500 grand and you can still save $60,000 per year with one income, right? If that is the case, then you don't need much of a surplus. You can take a $10,000 risk by acquiring an investment property, right? And that's costing you $10,000 per year that diminishes as the rent increases and hopefully as the rates decrease. Hopefully that's all making sense. Yeah, that's how I would approach it. Buffer first, safety first, right? Peace of mind first, and then work out what is the next move, right? And what entity to acquire the assets under. If someone has 3 million in portfolio amongst husband and wife, how much life insurance is recommended? 3 million portfolio, how much life inside of the SMSF? Can that be a full 3 mil sum assured for insurance policies for each? Look, how I normally run life insurance is different to other advisors. I tend to go on a wealth creation centric strategy first. And then we complement life insurances in there. So how I normally run life insurance calculations is I work out what is the bare minimum that the family needs if the worst case scenario were to happen. What is that bare minimum income that we want to replace, basically? And what we typically do is we run a 25%, 50%, 75%, and 100% of income, and we run an annuity calculator up to age 65 to work out exactly how much life, TPD, income protection, and critical illness we need, basically, right? So to answer your question about how much you need, it depends on how much income you want. I'm inclined to grow your wealth faster so you can get to self-insured sooner rather than spending $10,000, $20,000 per year on life insurances that may or may not be needed, right? I'd rather you grow your portfolio faster and spend $5,000 on life insurances than impede the wealth creation, because every single dollar that you put in life insurances is affecting the amount of investments that you can make, right? Because if you look at it from a perspective of cash flow, if you're spending $10,000 more and you can save that $10,000 and put it into your investment portfolio, that $10,000 could literally pay for a deficit of a $500,000, $600,000 property inside of your portfolio on a year-to-year basis. So you have to make a judgment call on what's the best move for you. I tend to go for the lowest amount needed of insurances. 3 mil seems high. I don't know what kind of debt position you've got, how old you are, how many kids you have, what are the kids' needs, and one of them disabled, all of these kinds of things. It's very, very difficult to answer that particular question without knowing your full circumstance. Exactly. All right. 55-year-old not working, husband's working. We have 7 investment properties with mostly paying for itself. Awesome. We have 35K mortgage on PPOR, 850 in super. We cannot borrow now to buy another investment property. What is the best move for us? Explore your SMSF. If you've got 850 in your SMSF and you've got one person working, you've got that. I'm not sure if you've got any borrowing capacity. If your investment properties are paying for itself, you might have enough to pull out some equity, and then you can do the park your equity strategy into your super. Not that you really need it at 850, but if you need to top up for serviceability, you can tap into maximizing concessional contributions, pre-tax contributions up to 30K, and topping up the non-concessional contributions, right, to warrant the extra serviceability that you need if you were to look at acquiring more properties inside of your SMSF, right? Okay, question for Laura. Have maxed out my non-concessionals and ATO asked me yearly to pay back. I have equity in my PPOR bought under a trust. Do I buy next in a new trust or under an SMSF? Oh, that's a tough one, Laura, because I don't know your whole context. It's very hard for me to say this one or the other without knowing exactly where you're at, how old you are, and all that kind of stuff. If you've maxed out your non-concessional contribution, that's $120,000 per year. That's quite a lot that you're maxing out. Maybe you've mentioned you meant concessional contributions. I'm not quite sure. Yeah, it's a hard one, Laura, for me to answer that one. You just have to make a judgment call. Is the best move trust or under an SMSF? If you're in your late 50s and if you can acquire under an SMSF, I wouldn't bother with a trust, right? Until you've maxed out your SMSF and in your late 50s or early 60s, I would be aiming to max out my SMSF exposure to property because that's where you get minimum tax payable upon sale. 10% max if you hold on to it for more than 1 year, 0%, right? Minimum if you sell upon retirement. Very powerful stuff. It's an awesome entity to acquire assets under, but you'd have to have a team behind you to make sure that it's all compliant.
Andrew, the reality of many of the questions that people are asking is that you can't really give a full answer until you know more about their circumstances. How can people get in touch with your team so they can give you the full story of their circumstances and get a better answer?
Yeah, the best move is to go to that website that I was sharing with you, put in your details. Our team will call you and see what the story is. We'll provide you with the necessary resources, basically. And if it's a fit, if we can help you, I'll bring you in and we can have a chat together and we can break down what the next steps are for your situation, basically. Right? So the best port of call is to register for those workshops, and then we'll give you a call within the next few days and see where we're at. And we can explore further, basically.
There is a link in the chat box with taking you to that workshop that you're referring to.
No worries, Michelle. So we have a PPR with a lot of equity, one investment property under personal, also with equity. However, we do not have serviceability due to children's private high school fees at the moment. Yep, my parents want to transfer the investment property to my brother and I. This transfer plus our next steps. After that, something you can advise about. Yes, we are growth oriented and frustrated by lack of serviceability. Yes, Michelle. So we would outline exactly how you would do that, so that you don't get slogged with taxes and you maximize the upside that you've got, because you've got a bunch of potential energy there, lots of potential as far as equity is concerned. It's about structuring it well so that you can tap into more serviceability for the future. Yep.
Okay. Well, it's probably a good point for us to wrap up today's webinar. Thank you, Andrew, for that presentation. Lots of questions from people out there in the audience, lots of engagement, which is always encouraging to see. What's the single most important message from your presentation today that you'd like people to take away with them and to act upon?
Single most important message. Just because you can buy a basketball from Rebel Sport, go to a basketball court and shoot a ball, doesn't mean you can play in the NBA. Now, what does that mean? It means you need to become a person who produces high returns, maximize your finances, right? Some of us, well, the very, very small amount of people can do it all themselves, basically, but most of us need help. So what I suggest you guys do is audit the stakeholders you have at the moment, who is in your ear and influencing your financial decisions. Make sure that their limiting beliefs is not slowing you down, because half of the problem is the people around you may have some self-sabotage going on in their lives and not knowingly passing it on to you and what you're trying to achieve, right? So what I suggest you do is audit the people around you and ask the question, are they helping you achieve your goals? Do they know your goals? And if they don't, why are they providing you with information and unsolicited advice that's not supposed to help you because they don't have the full context? So getting the right team around you is crucial so you can level up a hell of a lot faster, right? I didn't get to where I am just because I'm a go-getter and did it all myself. I work with the likes of Terry. I work with a bunch of different coaches. I've paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to get to where I am, to get the help I needed to level up to get to the next level, right? So what I suggest you guys do is have a think about what you're trying to achieve, and more importantly, who will get you to the next level sooner, basically, and tap into it. That's the best piece of advice, because that is the cheat code. If you get that right, you can level up a hell of a lot faster than someone else who's trying to reinvent the wheel.
Great note to end on, Andrew. Thank you for that. Just before we leave, I encourage everybody who's been watching and listening today to follow up, get in touch with Plenitude Wealth, have a chat about your situation, and maybe devise a strategy that can take you forward better and faster. That's it for now. Let's do it again soon, Andrew.
Sounds great. Thanks very much for your time, and appreciate the attention, guys. Chat soon. Cheers.